So continuing where we left off with saving throws, I wanted to draw your attention to two things. First, in the original document, saving throws are tucked underneath this heading called Magical Encounters. But really, if you look at the bottom here, it says basically it's a 3d6 check, and that you have to throw a number that equals or exceeds the number given. The other thing that you'll see is that the saving throw table in the original document has, for clerics, if you look all the way down there to the lower right-hand side, a dash. That, in my mind, is not a mistake, although it does come near the zero key. I suppose it could be a 0, maybe a 10. I doubt it, though, because what the rules explain are that the spiritual force is greater than the magical force, and therefore clerics are actually especially favored in being able to dispel magic and to also make saving throws against spells. Now, flipping over to the document that I am releasing, Dragons Beyond, you'll see that the saving throws are broken out by class and in some cases by race. As noted earlier, dwarves get an advantage in saves versus spells, as do other races. The other thing that you'll figure out very quickly is that this game is very much oriented toward players at lower class levels. They do not expect you to advance into those mid-tier, 14th level to 20th level, nor 20th and above levels. Although if you went back to the screenshot I had a few moments ago, there is some slight difference in the saving throws as listed. I've carried those over here. You note that the fighting men, for instance, go levels 8 through 11, even though when you look at the experience table progression, it caps out at 9. It means to me that same thing with clerics, same thing with magic users. It seems to be evident that there was some discussion, debate, uncertainty about what level would be the maximum level of advancement. Okay, enough on saving throws. Maybe one more thing on saves. So elves, as you know, can start as a fighting man or magic user. So these two tables have been contrived to kind of reconcile that by looking at the advancement in the original class, and then when you flip to the other dual class, which columns ought to actually stay the same or move forward, and how that should be done. I did my best with this. Other people may look at that original table and decide that they wanted to approach it a little bit differently. Divisions are the name for alignment in this pre-zero edition document. But again, you've got the same 3 alignments that you normally would: lawful, chaotic, and neutral. There was very little guidance, but I kept this almost word for word what was in the original manuscript, because this was the original conception of alignment. And I think it's got some interesting nuance in it. Divisional languages, so alignment languages, are a thing in zero edition. I made this an optional rule because it never has really gelled with most groups that this is how a language should work, right? If you are flipped to another alignment, you suddenly forget your previous alignment language and pick up the new one. It's kind of odd. It's not even something that you see in the fiction that underpins the game itself, right? If you go back to Michael Moorcock, I've got a million Michael Moorcock books up on the shelf. There's nothing about an alignment language in there. Traits. So instead of attributes or abilities, the original name in Beyond This Point Be Dragons is traits. They are similar to the ones that we see later. There are still 6 traits. There are differences, right? You're still rolling 3d6 down the line. You do have the ability to do these cash-ins, 2 for 1, for one trait into the trait of the prime requisite of the class you want to play. So you can do these 2-for-1 swaps, provided that you don't take it below the average range. The traits, though, so the descriptions are not fully given in the original document, and I didn't want to pull too much material forward from 1974 and beyond back into this document. So I've done my best to keep this as close as possible to the original language and add very little. So strength and intelligence, measures of physical and mental ability, that's my language, right? Cunning. So cunning is the analog to wisdom in this game. It is the prime requisite of clerics. If you look online at pro boards, there's an OD&D discussion about how this potentially was dexterity, reading some dictionary definitions from around the late 60s and early 70s. I disagree with that reading. When you look at Beyond This Point Be Dragons, the lingo around clerical spells indicate that there was a much more firm view of those as miracles and miracle working, and very much a tie into the Judeo-Christian pantheon, if you want to call it that. Anyway, so in this case, I pulled language from my own religious upbringing, right? And called cunning a measure of intuitive wisdom or slyness, akin to the natural wit or instincts of certain animals. For example, the cunning of a snake compared to the inherent gentleness of a dove. So I pulled that biblical verse kind of out here to give cunning a definition that does honor to Beyond This Point Be Dragons, and also the original conception that wisdom as cleric is not the same thing as dexterity at all. Health is constitution, very much acts and behaves like constitution, except for health gives you actually a floor under your hit point roll. You remember how I said that you can re-roll hit points at every level. So this provides a little bit of stability for your players, especially the ones that have better health, better constitution, to know that they're not going to get really screwed over when they're re-rolling hit points at every level. Hit point adjustments range from -2 to +2. Appearance, again, that's charisma, but not really charisma. This was strictly appearance. And so it says it's seldom used. They do give the same example that's given in a 0 edition. I've chosen to strike that language because it's a little bit sexist, the example that they use. And I'm leaving this up to the discretion of the referee, which is language I repeatedly used throughout the document, but did not use it here. But essentially, if you want to use appearance for something, go ahead, but it is not charisma. It does not modify your initial loyalty for henchmen. It does not modify encounter rolls unless the DM thinks that for some reason the character's appearance should factor into that roll. Moving back up here to ego. So ego is a measure of loyalty and health and loyalty and self-interest. Characters have ego, and then retainers and mercenaries, and even a domain has its own loyalty value toward its liege or towards the person that retained the employee of the mercenaries or retainers. The lingo here is directly out of Beyond This Point Be Dragons. It's interesting how it can change over time, and there are examples, this is some of that domain play stuff that kind of got dropped by Gygax in 0 edition. Gold pieces, of course, 3d6 times 10. Everything in this rule set is based on, and in Beyond This Point Be Dragons, is based on just copper, silver, and gold. And it's the 10-10-10 conversion, right? So 10 copper equals 1 silver, or 10 silver equals 1 gold. There's no platinum pieces or electrum pieces in this rule set, and I think that's more in line with the historic precedent that, again, underpins the rule set itself. Hit points, chops is Arnson's lingo. It was in the Beyond This Point Be Dragons rule set. Kept that lingo. Languages, so common is recognized. Halflings don't have their own language. They speak common. Again, there's the ability to learn additional languages. There's not a lot of guidance about what those languages are. Are giants grouped under a single language? I think when you look at the monsters later, yes, probably. Same thing for like the language of dragons, although maybe not. The example character sheet that was given, I think I've got it here, right? So the example, this is my own recreation of the original character sheet heading that was given. They've got eagle, dragon, and goblin, right? So goblin, we'll leave that out, but dragon seems to imply that dragon is a language that goes across all different colored dragons. Eagle would be a rock, apparently, but anyway, you're going to have your own feel or flavor as far as what languages characters can learn. Now, Prime Requisite does adjust XP, as you see here. The XP adjustments range from -25, quite harsh, to +10, which is more in line with what we're used to seeing. And then lastly, and this is a major difference between the playtest rules and 0th edition going forward, the language common may not actually be known to a character based on their intelligence. There's a possibility that their grasp of common is so poor that they're not even really literate. Similarly, there's this concept of reading Magi. I'm going to call it Magi. So there's not guidance about whether this should be rolled once per thing that you're trying to read, or whether it's just in general. Like, let's say I roll up a character, he has an intelligence of 9. He's only got a 45% chance to know Magi, right? Outside of his own learning library. So does that mean that the character just rolls one time, and if he fails that roll, then he doesn't know Magi? Or do you make this roll every time the character is trying to interpret something that he comes across that has Magi inscribed on it? I think it's less harsh to give the character multiple rolls, right? That means sometimes you can read it, sometimes you can't. I think that's more realistic and less harsh of a interpretation of what this column in the table would do when being played. Equipment and encumbrance, we're going to talk about later. This example that I've got here is slightly incorrect right now. I have introduced a slot-based encumbrance system based on the Old School Essentials playtest of a slot-based encumbrance system that goes up to 16 slots. It's pretty much 100 coins per slot, although bulkiness does factor into it. But all the coin values are still there. So those of you that are really old school about it and want to track it to the coin, certainly you can. Trait tests. So I put in there the ability to do a trait test based on 3d6. Going back to the saving throws being 3d6, trait tests I'm making 3d6 also. So you've got a bell curve. Central tendency is going to be factoring in. I do allow the referee to make 1, 2, or 3 pip adjustments to that based on their reading of the situation. Let me show you something else that's interesting to me. So there are 2 places in the 1st edition Player's Handbook where a trait test is given. One of them is the dig spell. It's a roll d20, roll under your dexterity to avoid falling in a pit as a saving throw. But there's also this 3d6 saving throw versus intelligence underneath the Phantasmal Killer spell. I think the fact that this is a 3d6 test in here and it has a range of modifiers down to -3 indicates that I'm kind of on the right track here with how I interpret trait tests to be in keeping with the original conception that later got kind of left behind. If you look at Holmes, he gives you an inkling that you can do any kind of dice roll, assign a probability, roll some dice, and figure it out. When you see Moldvay Basic under the heading of like there's always a chance, you see the trait test as we usually conceive of it, which is a d20 roll. But I think this 3d6 artifact that's in 1st edition Player's Handbook with the same modifier range that I've done, -3 to +3. You don't see +3, but it could be. I think that's more in keeping with what historically would have been done during the playtest. Relatives, this is lingo from Beyond This Point Be Dragons, which you also see in Zero Edition, about if a character dies, a relative might come into the picture and then inherit. But if the original character comes back to life or is somehow resurrected in the campaign or comes back from where they were missing in action, then the relative gets shunted kind of to the background. Although in Beyond This Point Be Dragons manuscript, that relative might actually not like that so much. And then finally, support and upkeep. We all have seen this before in Zero Edition, so this is very similar to what you see later on. And with that, I'm going to break. Next time, we'll get into experience points.